From Oxford in England, Richard Johnson, a lecturer in US politics at Queen Mary University of London. I wanted to ask you, first of all, Richard, about Elon Musk. We're none the wiser about what his actual role is here, but are you getting the feeling that he's an advisor helping shape this new cabinet, or will have a position in the cabinet himself?
I'd be somewhat surprised if he had a full-time government role, partly just because he's in charge of running these major business operations. And in order to take on a government position, he would surely be expected, according to ethics rules, to separate himself out from his business interests, which I just can't see him doing. So I think he'll probably stay as some kind of informal advisor. How long he actually has the ear of the president is another question. I mean, there were many people who had the ear of Donald Trump in his first term, but often those relationships did not last particularly long. And unlike someone like Susie Wiles, who Trump has now installed as his chief of staff, who he's known for many years, Musk is someone who Donald Trump didn't have long-standing deep relationships with until he became a major presidential candidate and president. And so I suspect that Musk is going to be a temporary advisor to the president. I would be really surprised if he's there 4 years from now.
Are they all yes people, the people he's appointing?
Certainly, the administration views that one of the big problems of the last time they appointed members was that they were not chosen with any sense of what their loyalty was to the president. I mean, people were showing up at Trump Tower with their CVs. It reminded me a little bit of when, before the age of the Civil Service Reform Act, the Pendleton Act of 1881, presidents used to be able to appoint everyone down to the postmaster or postmistress. And presidents like Abraham Lincoln used to just throw open the White House for a few hours a day, and people would come with their CVs and make their case to the president, and he would decide whether or not they would be the local customs agent or whatever in their community. They had an air of that kind of chaos about it. And I think this time, partly because Trump has really transformed the Republican Party much more so now in his image than was the case 8 years ago, he is able to have a much stronger sense of who's demonstrated loyalty, not just in words, but in actions over the past few years. So I do think that, of course, it's not just loyalty to him, although that's really important, but I think it's also a sense that there's a loyalty to his agenda and his mission. And that's become clearer, I think, for himself as well over time. So I think we should be expecting much greater alignment, both in terms of personal loyalty and what we might kind of call programmatic commitment.
When you look back on previous presidencies, do you look at this one thinking it's shaping up to be an incredibly powerful one? If he has a very loyalist cabinet combined with a loyal Senate, possibly quite a loyal House as well, and you could arguably say he's got a pretty loyal Supreme Court as well, seeing as he appointed many of the key members. How would you describe the power of this presidency as it's shaping up?
I mean, even compared to the first Trump term, Trump is in a much, much stronger political position than he was in 2017. He has transformed the composition of the Republican caucuses in the House and the Senate. In 2017, there were plenty of senators, people like Jeff Flake or John McCain, who were effectively never Trumpers. The Republican caucus now has basically cleared those people out, and that this is also true in the House. That House is much more MAGA now than it was in 2017. And we also have to think, as you mentioned, Max, that the court has shifted really profoundly. When Donald Trump was first became president in 2017, you had people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Anthony Kennedy, a kind of Republican moderate, a centrist on the court. Both of those individuals have now been replaced by full-throated, more conservative members of the court. And so Trump enters into an ecosystem where Congress is very pliant. The court is much more deferential. I think it will be much more deferential to his executive action than it had been eight years ago. And really, I mean, the probably one of the biggest signs of this is when Trump said that he would like the new Senate Majority Leader, whoever that may be, maybe Rick Scott, to as soon as the Republican Senate comes into session, to then go into recess. Why? So that Trump can appoint his cabinet without them having to go through confirmation hearings. Now, it's not that the Republican Senate would block those confirmation hearings, but he doesn't want Democrats on the committees to be able to ask them tough questions. I mean, this really, if they did that, that really is an extraordinary sign of Senate deference to the president, which would be hard to find a historical parallel to.
Yeah, it's a truly historic moment, isn't it? Richard in Oxford, thank you so much. What about what this means?